My mother-in-law decided I was beneath her standards because I came from a middle-class family and, worse, I wasn't afraid to repeat an outfit. She nitpicked my clothes, told me I should quit my job because it outshined her son, and never missed a chance to call me plain. What she never saw coming was that her own perfect image would unravel in front of everyone, ending with my father-in-law announcing their divorce right there at her anniversary party. If you've ever had a nightmare in-law, stick around and tell me in the comments. Let me show you how the trouble first began. The first encounter with class snobbery. The first time I met my mother-in-law, it didn't feel like a greeting. It felt like an inspection. She smiled politely, but her eyes traveled over me in a slow scan, the kind you expect from a judge, not a future relative. When the conversation shifted to what my parents did for a living, I watched her posture change instantly. She adjusted her necklace, her chin tilted just a little higher, and I could sense her mentally calculating whether her son had lowered the family's standards by choosing me. It wasn't just a meeting. It was an audition I had already failed without speaking a word. I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe she just had a stiff personality, but the comments started trickling in almost immediately. She complimented a friend's daughter for marrying the right kind of family with the right people, and then turned to me with a smile that left no doubt about what she meant. The way she drew attention to the difference between us wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. That was my introduction into her world of subtle humiliation disguised as casual conversation. The defining moment, though, came during a family lunch not long afterward. I wore a plain white blouse I'd worn once before. Nothing remarkable, just one of my favorites. My mother-in-law looked directly at me and, in front of the table, remarked how well-off families don't usually repeat clothes like that. Then she added that it was a little embarrassing. The words landed heavy because they weren't just about the shirt. They were about where I came from, who she thought I was, and where she wanted to place me on her imaginary ladder. I smiled tightly, my cheeks warmer than the coffee in front of me, and pretended her words didn't sting. That moment became the pattern. Whenever she caught sight of me in an outfit she'd already logged in her memory, she made a point of calling it out as though I had broken some silent family code. For her, repetition in clothing wasn't normal. It was a public failure to uphold her version of status. I sometimes wondered if she really imagined wealthy people burned their clothes after a single use. What struck me most was how rehearsed her tone was, like she was laying down a rule she expected me to follow. In her world, image was everything, and I was already falling short. Mark did step in a few times, trying to diffuse her barbs. He'd cut across the table with a quick, "Mom, don't start," or make a joke to pull the attention away from me. I appreciated it, but his words bounced off her. She never raised her voice, never outright yelled, so on the surface they read as polite corrections. Yet she chose her settings carefully, delivering those lines in front of others so that no matter how lightly she said them, the embarrassment settled squarely on me. It became clearer with each encounter that this wasn't about fashion or etiquette. It was about power. She wanted me to wear reminders of my place every time we sat at the same table, and she knew clothing was the easiest way to do it. What she didn't realize was how obvious it made her insecurity look. Anyone paying attention could see that her obsession with appearances revealed a woman clinging to image as her only real measure of worth. That first clash over a repeat outfit was only the start. What began as small digs quickly turned into her main path of control. She wasn't content just pointing out what I wore. She found new ways to involve herself, making her opinions unavoidable. And that's when the comments, which once felt like random jabs, started growing into something bigger. The wardrobe policing was about to move from cruel remarks to something even more exhausting. The outfit policing escalates. At first, it was just comments I could brush off, but not for long. Once she realized she had struck a nerve with the whole repeat outfit idea, my mother-in-law took things up a notch. She didn't leave it at remarks across the dinner table. Instead, she began orchestrating outings like a general scheduling a mission. There wasn't an invitation, only a flat announcement. "We're going to such and such boutique at 11. Be ready." Her tone didn't suggest a shopping trip. It sounded more like I'd been booked for an evaluation. The boutiques were a world I wouldn't have entered on my own. These weren't regular stores with affordable racks to flip through. They were bright, glossy spaces where one dress carried the price tag of a month's rent. I would pace politely, too nervous to even brush my fingers against the racks, while she glided through like she owned the place. Every so often, she'd pick up something garish, rhinestones clustered like armor, sequins reflecting every light. She'd hold the piece up against me, tilting her head, measuring me like fabric on a mannequin. Without fail, she'd deliver her line, sharp but rehearsed. "Now this shows family presence." That phrase became her catch-all justification. Any hesitation I had was quickly shut down by the reminder that my wardrobe represented all of them. It didn't matter that Mark could show up to family functions in jeans without a second glance. For me, every shirt, skirt, or shoe supposedly carried the reputation of her household. Comfort, personal taste, practicality, none of it counted in her system. What counted was whether it looked like the polished, ornamental image she wanted to parade. And of course, these weren't just trips for browsing. She would insist on buying whatever piece she had selected for me. I remember one in particular, a neon blazer, the kind of electric color that screamed game show host. She presented it proudly, as if no reasonable person would refuse it. At the register, I forced out a thank you, our cheeks stiff while she watched me approve the purchase with a strained smile plastered on my face. But in my head, I was already drafting excuses for when she inevitably asked why I hadn't worn it yet. Sure enough, by the very next family dinner she brought it up, casually probing, her eyes practically scanning my wardrobe choices on arrival. The gifts weren't generous gestures, they were strings tied tightly. Tokens meant to remind me she had chosen what I should look like. It was unsettling, but also exhausting, because even when I picked something on my own, something simple and comfortable, she'd deflate the choice instantly. She'd say, twisting her lips. "Well, next time, maybe let me find you something more polished." As though my clothes needed her personal stamp before they counted. The ritual repeated with different outfits, different stores, all circling back to the same theater of control. One particular shopping trip still sits in my memory, like a bad sitcom episode. She held up a gold sequined gown, gleaming head to toe, a piece fit for a red carpet event. We weren't headed to an award show. We had a barbecue planned. I mumbled something about it being impractical, but she gave me that long stare, steady and unwilling to bend. Then, softer but sharper, she repeated the line about family presence. That was the end of the discussion. My opinion had never been part of the script. What made it worse was how she carried these performances into conversations with others. If a friend or relative admired a dress I was wearing, she would jump in before I could answer, bragging about the boutique she had introduced me to. It wasn't about me at all. It was about her. To her, my appearance was a badge she designed, something she could flash as proof that she still defined the family image. After a while, it became difficult to ignore the truth. She wasn't guiding me out of kindness, and she wasn't gifting clothes to make me feel included. She was propping up her own reflection, making sure everyone understood she still micromanaged the details of her son's household. The more she reached for control, the more transparent her intentions became. I realized she wasn't trying to help me look confident. She was buying costumes to prove she remained the director of the show. The change in how I saw it was subtle at first. I stopped feeling guilty for not wearing her pics. Instead, I almost found a strange amusement in how passionate she was about controlling fabrics and hems. What once made me uncomfortable now revealed something glaring. Her so-called elegance needed constant props. Without them, her authority felt thinner, shakier, and in her rush to correct me, she was practically showing her hand to everyone else in the room. But no matter how controlling the clothing drama became, I started to sense it wasn't the final act. As intrusive as her shopping trips and remarks were, they weren't the only arena she wanted to dominate. Clothes, I realized, were just a testing ground. It wasn't long before she shifted her focus to something far more personal and far more threatening: the career threat. My mother-in-law's fixation on my clothes was exhausting enough, but soon her attention landed squarely on something that mattered to me far more: my career. She stopped caring about colors and fabric choices and started talking instead about my paycheck, my title, and whether I had any right to keep them after marrying her son. I had built my career step by step in the pharmaceutical industry. It wasn't a shortcut, and it wasn't easy. I spent years buried in textbooks, racking up student loans, and working nights that bled into mornings. All of it paid off. By the time Mark and I married, I was in a field known to pay well, and I was proud of the work I did. It wasn't just about the salary, though providing comfortably for ourselves was a major plus. I liked waking up every day knowing what I did mattered. Mark supported me fully. From the very beginning, he was proud of how hard I pushed myself, encouraged me when the workload was heavy, and celebrated milestones beside me. But while his pride grew with each of my accomplishments, his mother's narrowed into dislike. The way she bristled any time my work came up should have been a warning. At a family dinner one evening, what started as simple conversation turned into a clash I hadn't expected. I casually mentioned completing a project that months earlier had felt out of reach. Mark congratulated me immediately. His dad offered a polite smile, and then her voice cut through. She leaned across the table with a serious look and asked, "Doesn't it cause problems when you might end up out-earning Mark?" She might as well have accused me of stealing something. I thought she was joking. I even laughed quickly to lighten the tension, but her eyes didn't soften. They stayed locked on me, sharp and disapproving. She followed with, "When you two married, I expected you'd leave your job. A wife advancing past her husband looks very wrong for this family." Her certainty made my fork freeze above my plate. For a moment, I couldn't even form a sentence. Years of work, of sacrifice, and dedication, dismissed in a single breath as something inappropriate once vows were exchanged. Her explanation unraveled quickly. She insisted my paycheck would humiliate her son. She said people would talk if a woman in their family became the big earner. She painted marriage like a contract where my independence was the first item to be traded away, as if leaving my career would prove devotion. My silence only seemed to encourage her to keep tightening the argument, as though repeating it would make it logical. Inside, I was stunned. My professional identity was not just a hobby. It represented every late night and every long shift I had survived to build a future. And here she was, treating it like an accessory I could take off and store in a closet if it clashed with her son's reputation. I glanced at Mark then, unsure if he'd expect me to defend myself, or worse, agree with her outright. But before I could gather the words, Mark cut in, firm, clear, and louder than he usually ever dared in his mother's presence. "Her career is not up for discussion. She's worked too hard for anyone to demand she quit. She's proud of it, and so am I." His tone wasn't polite. It had weight. The table went silent, and for the first time his mother had no immediate comeback. That moment did more than defend me. It exposed the real imbalance at play. She framed her demand as if stepping away from my job was tradition, as if every family would understand. But Mark's rejection of her argument showed what was actually true. This wasn't tradition. It was her own insecurity, dressed up as family honor. Standing up to her revealed that the only person worried about my career was her. I answered after his defense, keeping my voice even. I explained I loved my work, that I had no intention of giving it up, and that respecting marriage did not mean discarding ambition. My words landed softly but firmly, and while she shifted in her chair and pursed her lips, she didn't push again during that dinner. The relief I felt wasn't just because Mark had my back. It was because his support made clear that this imaginary rulebook existed only in her mind. He applauded me when I got promoted. He encouraged me when tough days stretched long. He never viewed my success as competition. To him, our marriage was about partnership. His pride wasn't dimmed by mine, and my paycheck didn't threaten his role as my husband. His reaction underlined how absurd her demand truly was. I did leave that dinner unsettled, though. Not because she had control over me. She didn't. But because her attempt said so much about how far she was willing to go. The endless critiques about clothing almost looked small compared to this, because this wasn't about taste or style. It was about dismantling everything I had built, simply so she could keep her picture of family, unmarred by what others might think. That night, I recognized something important. When she couldn't dictate how I dressed, she tried to dictate if I worked. Millimeter by millimeter, she kept searching for control, moving from one front to another. And while Mark's defense ended this particular argument, the silence that followed was heavy. I could already sense she would find another route, another way to reassert influence. And she did. The manipulative guilt trips. The next thing she leaned on wasn't clothes or careers. It was her health, or at least the fragile version of it that appeared whenever it suited her. She developed a habit of making every disagreement feel like a medical emergency. A sigh became a warning. A hand pressing against her chest became a performance. Arguments suddenly carried the risk of being accused of pushing her to the brink of collapse. One scene still sits in my memory. We had stopped by her house after she had snapped at me for missing a brunch she arranged without checking our schedule first. Mark gently told her we already had plans. Her body stiffened, and then, almost on cue, she shut her eyes, tipped her head back, and whispered about her blood pressure. Within moments, she was calling for water, holding her forehead like she might faint. I sat there frozen, unsure if I should grab the car keys and head to the ER, or wait for her curtain call. The timing could not have been more obvious. 1 second a brisk argument, the next second a supposed health spiral. She repeated the same lines almost every time. I don't think my heart can handle this stress. Or, you may not have me much longer if these things keep happening. They weren't just words, they were weapons. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Relatives would circle around, speaking in soft tones, trying to soothe her. Yet, no matter where I stood, she never once acknowledged me. I could ask if she was okay, but my words might as well have been spoken into thin air. By ignoring me entirely and directing her needs to everyone else, she made sure I was excluded from both the concern and the relief afterward. The difficult part wasn't being dismissed. That had become routine. It was watching the effect on Mark. He knew her well enough to see a pattern forming, but this wasn't just any person pulling stunts. This was his mother. With every gasp and heavy sigh, she put him in an impossible bind. Defend me and risk hurting her, or soothe her and leave me sidelined. What she was really demanding in those moments wasn't care, it was loyalty. And she twisted guilt into the lever to get it. Sometimes she staged her health dips at family gatherings too. If Mark laughed too much with me or gave me his full attention, she would suddenly become too weak to stay standing. She'd lower herself into a chair, wave people over, and let out airless sighs while avoiding my presence altogether. There were nights when I caught cousins or aunts exchanging quiet glances, recognizing the pattern themselves. Her act was out in the open, obvious to anyone paying attention. When she really wanted to push things, she used the phone. After Mark supported me about keeping my job, she called him daily for a week to dramatize her condition. She described long nights without sleep, a failing pulse, even muttered warnings like, "You should come see me, it may be too late soon." Then, the very next day, she would regain her energy as if all signs of illness had vanished. I even teased Mark once that she seemed to be the only person alive who could go from being close to death's door to briskly walking across her living room in under 24 hours. He stifled a smile, but we both knew it wasn't really funny. Those phone calls and staged collapses put Mark in knots. On one side was me, asking for boundaries and fairness. On the other side was his mother insisting she was hanging by a thread, each objection apparently pushing her closer to the edge. Questioning her meant questioning her health, and who wants to be the child blamed for harming their mother? Even when he recognized the exaggeration, the guilt pressed hard against him. That was the brilliance of her approach. It didn't need to be true to work. It just needed him to hesitate long enough to put her needs above mine. For me, the most painful thing was watching him struggle in that tug-of-war. He wasn't blind. He just couldn't easily reconcile the idea that the woman who raised him would play frailty like a card from her sleeve. So I had to hold back, let him process, and remind myself that each repeated performance made the truth harder for him to ignore. Eventually, her pattern began to fray out in the open. The sighs, chest-clutching, and carefully worded laments no longer carried the same grip on the room. Relatives stopped rushing at the first hint of weakness. Instead, they muttered under their breath, exchanging looks that said quietly what no one dared state out loud: that maybe she wasn't as sick as she pretended. Mark noticed too. He started spotting the timing of her recoveries and the way her episodes always appeared when she wasn't winning an argument. Her guilt trips still stung, but their sharpness dulled with repetition. She wanted to cast herself as fragile, but she only ended up showing how relentless her attempts at control had become. I could feel the tide shifting, though slowly. Every time she ignored me while clinging to others' sympathy, she exposed the act just a little more. And every time Mark had to watch the coincidence of her health miraculously failing right when he sided with me, it planted another seed of doubt. What had once been her strongest weapon, the idea she was too weak to handle disagreement, was now becoming a thin disguise. Nobody said it openly, but the whispers and skeptical looks gave her game away. And though that realization didn't stop her from trying, its effect was already weakening. So by the time the next major family event arrived, the one that was supposed to shine a light on a joyful chapter in our lives, the foundation for her next disruption had already been laid. None of her past tactics prepared me for the way she would try to turn that evening into yet another battlefield. Engagement party sabotage. Our engagement party should have been simple: laughter, music, a little champagne, and people happy to celebrate us. For most of the night, it almost felt like that. The decorations were modest but pretty, our friends and family filled the room, and for once, there wasn't a sharp comment ringing in my ears. I let myself believe she might let the evening pass without incident. That thought lasted right up until someone asked to see my ring. I held out my hand with pride. It wasn't extravagant, but it was exactly right because it came from Mark, chosen by him, saved for, and given with all the meaning in the world. From the corner of my vision, I saw her eyes narrow, following the sparkle on my finger as if tracking a rival. Then she extended her own hand, slowly, deliberately, her ring catching the light. She rotated it back and forth, until every guest nearby had no choice but to notice. The look on her face was sour, but the problem wasn't with her ring. It was the fact that mine drew attention she didn't want to share. The silence around us thickened when she muttered, just loud enough for the room to hear, that some girls today expect luxuries far beyond their worth. Guests shifted in their chairs, clearly uncomfortable, but she pushed further. Turning directly to Mark, she asked why he had spent money on me but never replaced her ring after decades of marriage. Her voice carried across the room. It wasn't a joke, it was an accusation. Suddenly, the night belonged to her grievance. She listed sacrifices she had made, years she said had gone unrecognized, how men today spent on fiancés while mothers were left forgotten. It was jealousy delivered as performance, dragging every person in that room into the comparison. My cheeks burned, not from shame but from frustration. After everything else, here she was, turning even our engagement into her own stage. I had listened to enough. I steadied my voice and told her my ring was between Mark and me, no one else. And if she felt disregarded, that discussion belonged with her husband, not her son, and certainly not me. The room dropped silent with those words. A few relatives stared at their drinks, others looked away, and my father-in-law shifted uncomfortably. She, on the other hand, froze in disbelief. Her face went red before she shoved her chair back and stood up, rigid with anger. She announced that she would not be disrespected in my own family like this, and then walked out, the slam of the door cutting into the chatter left behind. The atmosphere bent under the weight of her absence, uneasy, but also lighter. People whispered, some pretending nothing had happened, while Mark kept his hand on mine as if steadying the moment back into what it had been. Without her shadow, the evening slowly turned toward joy again. And for me, that night became the first proof that she couldn't dictate everything. The following day, she called Mark and then me. Her words were measured, half apologetic, muttered with the excuse of too much wine. She claimed nerves and emotion got ahead of her. I accepted the explanation on the surface. It was easier than carrying the party further into bitterness. Letting it go felt temporary, but I wanted to move forward without more damage. What I didn't say was that I was beginning to see her apologies as brief pauses, never real fixes. And while I tried to forgive for the sake of peace, the entire event left a mark. That party showed me clearly that no milestone was sacred enough to escape her interference. The ring, the vows, even the gathering of friends, everything was at risk of being turned into an audience for her discontent. I knew then that the hardest parts were still ahead. The engagement party didn't end her behavior. It just sharpened the way I braced for it. And as I soon discovered, planning the next step only gave her new ground to attack. Wedding dress wars. When it came time to shop for my wedding dress, I wanted to believe it would be one of those bright days you remember for the right reasons. I pictured relaxed laughter with close friends, a search for something meaningful, and maybe even a tear or two when I found the perfect gown. But that idea evaporated the second my mother-in-law announced she would be joining, uninvited but absolutely determined. She made it clear that, as Mark's mother, she deserved not just to be present, but to have influence over anything I might choose. For her, it wasn't only about a dress. It was, once again, about preserving the family image she thought she owned. From the first moment I stepped out in a sample gown, she treated it less like a wedding appointment and more like a public trial. A satin dress, dismissed as too shiny. An airy A-line, brushed off with, "That makes you look too plain." Each comment was loud, certain, calculated to sting. The boutique staff caught each remark and glanced over nervously, but she never gave them room to step in. The opinion of anyone else in the room didn't matter. Only hers did. Then the moment came when I pulled the curtain back in a dress I quietly loved. It wasn't flashy or expensive, but when I looked in the mirror, I could admit to myself it felt right. For once, I felt at ease. Like this could be the gown I walked toward Mark in. That was when she leaned back in her chair, crossed her legs, and delivered the line that silenced the entire room. "It makes your arms look fat." She said it casually, almost bored, like she was commenting on the weather. But the deliberate weight of those 6 words crushed the air out of the space. My best friend's mouth dropped open. One of the attendants froze where she was standing, and I just swallowed hard, forcing myself to laugh off the sting with a half smile. But inside, it cut. Not because she disliked the dress, not even because she insulted me in front of everyone, but because at that moment, she stripped away all pretense. She wasn't just shaping choices anymore. She wanted me humiliated, vulnerable, pressing where she suspected I might be sensitive. That day, the dress wasn't the target. I was. From there, nothing pleased her. Every dress I stepped into, no matter the detail, she rejected outright. The words shifted slightly, "That color washes you out, that neckline looks cheap," but they all carried the same message: I wasn't enough, and nothing I chose ever would be. Eventually, she gave up the running commentary and moved into sulking silence, arms folded tight, face turned away. The performance felt less like disappointment and more like calculation. If she couldn't direct my choice, she would punish me with disapproval, radiating it so thick the walls of the boutique seemed to absorb it. By the time the appointment ended, I hadn't chosen a dress. What I had chosen quietly was something else entirely. I was tired of acting as if pleasing her was a reasonable effort. I was done letting her dictate the atmosphere around my own life's milestones, and I didn't realize just how ready I was to change course until we stepped outside. She assumed, without asking, that I would drive her home. We had left her car at our place earlier, so she fell in step beside me, expecting me to pull the car around. But something in my chest resisted. The entire ride would have been filled with silence, tension, and her folded arms' resentment, and suddenly I couldn't picture myself granting her even that comfort. So I stopped where I stood and said plainly, "I'm not giving you a ride today. I need space after what just happened." The pause between us stretched long. She blinked, as if the refusal was unthinkable. Her voice never found a rebuttal. She simply pursed her lips, set her jaw, and walked back toward the boutique's bench, like I had personally broken some unspoken law. My heart pounded all the way back to the driver's seat, but as I turned the ignition, the moment carried with it a strange kind of release. It wasn't really about transportation. It was about refusing her control. All those digs about outfits, about my job, and now about the dress, had been her way of drawing the boundaries of my life as if they belonged to her. But by saying no to something as small as a ride home, I proved to myself that her grip wasn't permanent. I didn't need to absorb her sulking, her disapproval, her constant demands to fold myself into her vision. That 20-second choice outside a bridal boutique felt more powerful than all the comments she had fired at me all day. Driving home alone, I revisited the scene in my head, part bitter, part amused. Bitter at the cruelty of her delivery, amused at the image of her sulk, how she sat back in the boutique like a child denied candy. But most of all, I felt relief. For the first time, I had drawn a clean line, and there was no undoing it. That line wasn't about fighting over fabric or lace. It was about reclaiming decisions she had no right to own. Later that night, when Mark asked how the appointment went, I gave him the truth. I told him about her comment, about how small it made me feel, and about how I finally said no by refusing to drive her home. He put his hand on mine and said nothing, but the quiet way his thumb pressed against my palm told me he understood. More than that, it told me he approved. The dress shopping itself hadn't ended the way I planned. I left without a gown, but in another way, I left with what I needed even more: clarity. She could cut, criticize, and sulk all she wanted, but my voice wasn't going anywhere. That was the first real moment I trusted myself not to bend. From then on, I realized she would keep shifting her focus, keep searching for whatever new leverage she could find. The dress was only one attempt. There would always be something else to control, another stage for her to turn into a performance, and she proved me right faster than I expected. The baby pressure. Not long after the wedding, the focus shifted again. Clothes, jobs, even the dress drama, they all faded into the background. What mattered now, in her eyes, was grandchildren. She brought it up so bluntly that it stopped feeling like excitement and landed instead like another obligation she believed I owed her. At family lunches, she leaned across the table, lowered her voice just enough to feign intimacy, and asked, "Any news yet?" It wasn't a question. It was an expectation dressed as casual conversation, repeated enough to drain every ounce of patience I had. At first, I smiled politely, thinking if I gave her empty answers, the topic might dissolve on its own. But she escalated with each attempt. She didn't want vague reassurances. She wanted dates, specifics, a timeline, as though we were employees reporting to a manager. During one dinner, she frowned at us over her wine glass and announced to the entire table that newlyweds shouldn't waste too much time on travel if they intended to start a family. The phrasing made it sound less like we were building a marriage and more like we were behind schedule on a production quota. It didn't stop at questions about timing. She began peppering in the language of urgency, using her favorite phrase, the biological clock. Sometimes she would tap her watch for effect and remark, "Time doesn't wait for anyone." Other times, she turned it into overt warnings, sighing loudly about what a mistake it would be to delay too long. Her small remarks were delivered like ticking alarms, uninvited and relentless. What should have been ordinary meals or holidays carried attention no one wanted to name outright. The atmosphere bent around her obsession, and every interaction threatened to detour back to the same interrogation. What made it worse was how openly personal she became. She blurred boundaries in ways I didn't think anyone would dare. Once, with guests sitting less than a foot away, she looked straight at me and asked if I was trying hard enough to give the family what it needed. Utter silence followed, broken only by the clinking of silverware, but she carried on nonchalantly as if nothing inappropriate had been said. I was left frozen in place, cheeks burning, holding a fork I no longer had the appetite to use. Her probing never softened with embarrassment or shame. It hardened, brazen, delivered with the certainty of someone who believed silence equaled permission. The pressure soon reached Mark as well. She began pulling him aside, asking in clipped tones when he planned to give her what she deserved. By then it was obvious, she didn't just want to know our plans, she wanted control over them. And because details gave her leverage, she went after both of us, convinced she might corner one if the other refused to bend. With each push, the joy of our early married life dimmed a little, muted by the background noise of her constant demands. Eventually, we decided the only way to stop the speculation was to tell her the truth. Mark and I had agreed long before the wedding that we didn't want children. It wasn't a flippant choice, it was one we had discussed carefully and felt secure in together. We were content with our life as it was, satisfied with the future we were building. But when we finally said it out loud to her, it landed like a bomb. Her reaction was instant and unrestrained. She gasped, clutched her chest, and accused me of corrupting her son, shouting that no man in her family would ever make such a decision unless pressured. The accusations tumbled out one after another. Claims that I was selfish, claims that I had hidden my real intentions until it was too late, even sweeping declarations that refusing children was an insult to her and a betrayal of their legacy. It wasn't disappointment anymore. It was fury, directed squarely at me. And then the threats started. She launched into a tirade about inheritance, warning that if we denied her grandchildren, she would ensure neither of us benefited from her estate. She repeated, for all to hear, that she had the power to rewrite her will, and that people who defied her wishes would not be rewarded. The room sat stunned, relatives trapped between shame and disbelief at how quickly her demands for lineage turned into financial punishment. For her, love and loyalty had become transactions, and family legacy a bargaining chip. I might have cracked under the weight of it if Mark hadn't stepped forward. His face was set, his voice steady when he told her to stop. He stood directly in front of me, shoulder rigid, height deliberate, as if shielding me from the words she kept throwing in our direction. He said clearly that our decision wasn't up for discussion, and never would be. He reminded her that our marriage wasn't an audition for her approval, and that threatening us, whether with guilt or with money, would change nothing. His words didn't need anger to carry force. They landed because they were final. He wasn't asking for her understanding. He was telling her the boundary was drawn. The weight of that defense was huge. For months, she had counted on him wavering, on him being the bridge she could cross to override me. But this time, he didn't flinch. He didn't hedge or soften. He chose his side, and it was ours. Watching her fumble in the silence that followed, mouth half open, arguments stalled, was surreal. She tried to summon another scene, first reaching for her familiar lines about stress and illness, but no one jumped. Even her father-in-law stayed quiet, staring ahead instead of backing her. For the first time, she stood in a room filled with people and found herself without allies in the fight she started. That day, the control she had pressed at for years cracked in plain sight. Her grip on appearances, her habit of using guilt as leverage, it all slipped when Mark confirmed out loud what I had known privately. She no longer decided what path we took. The pressure she had built so carefully collapsed under the weight of its own repetition. In trying to dictate our future, she proved only how little power she really had. And yet, even as the shouting subsided and people drifted into quieter conversations, a charge lingered in the room. She wasn't done. Not really. You could see it in the tight set of her jaw, in the way her eyes darted across family members as if searching for someone to back her. There was no retreat in that look, only regrouping. Which is why, when the next family celebration came, one designed to showcase her life and her marriage, I braced myself. If she couldn't gain control through clothes, careers, or even grandchildren, I knew she'd find some other angle. And as we walked into her anniversary party, polished and perfect on the surface, I had no idea just how quickly the mask would slip. The anniversary party explosion. Her 25th wedding anniversary looked flawless on the surface. The hall glowed with chandeliers, tables sparkled with crystal glasses, and guests arrived polished and beaming. Every detail had been chosen to present a perfect family milestone. She greeted people cheerfully, the camera-ready smile never faltering, as if the night would be remembered only for elegance and togetherness. But beneath that shine was the tension everyone in her orbit knew too well. And when she took hold of the microphone, the mood shifted fast. At first, her speech played along to expectation. She thanked the guests for coming, recited a few phrases about devotion and partnership, and gave compliments about how beautiful the setup looked. For a brief minute, it seemed like she might leave the evening intact. Then I caught the way her grip tightened around the mic, her lips stiffening into that familiar, calculated smile. Her eyes swept the crowd, pausing long enough to ensure every gaze rested on her, and then her focus fixed directly on me. Pause here for delivery. Let the audience feel the silence before the drop. What came out of her mouth next was not a stumble in speech. It was sharp, deliberate, and designed to leave a scar. She announced to the entire room that I had lied about having a miscarriage. No hesitation, no softening, just the blunt accusation cutting through the hall. For a second, it was hard to process. My ears rang, and the room blurred as I tried to decide if I had misheard. Then the reaction around me confirmed the reality. Gasps swept the tables, chairs screeched as people shifted, wide eyes turned in my direction. The weight of her words landed hard. Something private, something vulnerable, had just been twisted into a public accusation at her own wedding anniversary party. I sat frozen. My chest tightened, my heartbeat drummed too fast to keep rhythm, and hot tears pressed at the corners of my eyes. I couldn't speak. My throat closed up, my tongue heavy, my body refusing words, even as anger and humiliation burned inside me. The bright lights around the hall suddenly felt glaring, unbearable. Mark was out of his chair before I had even moved. His voice carried across the silence, sharp and furious. He told her she had crossed a line, that dragging my pain into a microphone speech was cruel, unforgivable, and nothing he would allow. Guests turned to watch as his usual calm cracked wide open into outrage. His hands trembled, but it wasn't fear. It was pure fury at his mother's choice. She didn't back down. She lifted the mic again and doubled down, insisting that my story was nothing more than a play for sympathy. She painted me as an actress, not a wife, a woman who used sorrow to gather attention. Each new statement came colder, her voice carrying the kind of conviction meant to silence objections. I crumbled in my seat, tears spilling freely now, cheeks burning as her words soaked into the crowd. For a moment, the entire party felt stripped of its purpose. This wasn't an anniversary anymore. It was a spectacle, with me set as the target of her performance. But then a shift began. It was small at first, the low hum of murmurs crossing tables, a muttered, "That's disgraceful," from one guest. A louder, "Not here, not tonight," from another. Slowly, the silence cracked into open disapproval. People shook their heads, whispered furiously, others stared at her in disbelief. Relatives looked between me and Mark, some frowning openly now. What she had expected to be a triumphant attack was collapsing into backlash. The energy in the room bent visibly. I felt a hand squeeze my shoulder gently, a quiet show of support from someone behind me. A cousin shot me a sympathetic glance. Guests didn't view her as the dignified hostess anymore. They saw cruelty spelled out, live, without disguise. The glitter of the anniversary decor only emphasized the contrast. She had tried to orchestrate a flawless celebration, and instead what stood gleaming under the chandeliers was her own bitterness. For her, every milestone was another stage to exert control. But in lighting her attack on me, she had flipped the script without realizing it. No one was admiring her polished image. They were staring at her unraveling. It was written in the stiff silence between gasps, in the judgment glances she couldn't ignore, in the chorus of faces seeing her without the mask. I could see Mark standing taller, steadier, as relatives rallied to our side with quiet solidarity. For once, it wasn't just him against her. The fault line had opened too widely to hide. My humiliation was real, but so was the crowd's recognition of who she truly was. Still, she kept talking. Her words stumbled, desperate, as she tried to steer the tide back under her control. But the air didn't bend for her anymore. Every insistence, every accusation only deepened the disbelief around the room. Where she expected power, there was only distance growing at each table, her audience slipping from her grasp. And then, as her voice filled the hall with yet another round of venom, someone else stood up. For years he had been quiet, more shadow than speaker, never cutting across her dominance. This time, though, he began to move toward the microphone, and the moment he reached for it, all sound dropped away. That sudden shift, the entire room bracing, was the first clear sign that everything about the night was about to change. The karma moment. For as long as I had known him, my father-in-law kept to the background. At family gatherings, he was the man with the polite smile, offering a chuckle at the right moments before retreating into silence whenever his wife began to dominate the room. Most of us assumed it was resignation rather than agreement. He nodded along, rarely cutting in, rarely risking confrontation. His quiet presence had become part of the expected family rhythm. But that night, something cracked through years of stillness. The scrape of his chair against the polished floor cut through the room like a sharp blade. Conversations halted mid-whisper. Guests turned their heads, surprised to see him rising at all. He wasn't a man given to sudden gestures, and certainly not in rooms where his wife reigned. Even she faltered, her mouth still half open with words unfinished, her eyes narrowing as if she wasn't sure what she was witnessing. He walked forward in deliberate steps, unhurried but resolute, steady enough that each one echoed against the hush. At the front, he stopped beside her. Her fingers were clamped around the microphone, visibly tense. He reached forward and with a calm firmness slipped it from her grip. No struggle, no public spat, just a simple handoff that spoke louder than anything else in that moment. The hall fell into full silence, so quiet a spoon settling into a glass could be heard. Pause delivery here. Let the audience feel the stillness before the words come. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't raised. It was measured, even, almost painfully calm. And in that steadiness came the weight of decades. He announced in front of everyone, from family to neighbors to colleagues, that he wanted a divorce. Not whispered in the aftermath, not postponed for a private conversation. He said the words openly, into the microphone, at the very party meant to celebrate their 25 years of marriage. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and sharp. The guests froze, eyes wide, chairs breaking against the floor as people turned to listen again, as if they might have misheard him. But there was no mistake. He said it plainly, and there was no humor or hesitation in his tone. Glasses were lowered quietly to the table. Waitstaff paused mid-step. It was as if some invisible cord had snapped across the hall. Her response was unlike anything I had ever seen. For once, she had no lines prepared, no sigh or polished remark waiting. Her jaw slackened, leaving her frozen in front of her carefully curated audience. The muscles in her face flickered with disbelief. Her head turned slightly as if begging someone, anyone, to tell her it wasn't real. But no one spoke up. She opened and closed her mouth as if words might emerge, yet none did. After all her years of controlling conversations, her silence was almost startling. He didn't gloat or smirk when he continued. His voice carried no anger, just resolution. He explained that he had endured her control, her temper, and her need to dominate for longer than he cared to admit. He said he had tolerated it for the sake of appearances, for the sake of keeping peace, and most of all for Mark, while he was growing up. But the line for him came that very night, when she accused me publicly and twisted grief into spectacle. That, he said, marked the end. His words rippled across the room because they were simple and final. He didn't lace them with excuses or threats. He told her, clearly and without theatrics, that she had pushed too far, and he refused to waste what remained of his life under her shadow. It wasn't loud, but it carried. It sounded like someone putting down a burden he had carried for decades, one too heavy to shoulder any longer. Guests shifted uneasily, the truth dawning even on those who had always assumed he would never defy her. This wasn't a drunken outburst or a misplaced comment. It was a decision. One he had allowed to stay unspoken until that exact night, her night, on her stage. And now, everyone was watching her lose what she had held onto so tightly. For once, the spotlight she craved so constantly was aimed in the wrong direction. She stood there grasping at dignity, but the room didn't return to her. People looked her way, but not for guidance or admiration. They looked to witness her unraveling. Without saying anything, every set of eyes reminded her what she had just lost, that her version of control had ended in front of an audience. Even more telling was the absence of rescue. None of the relatives scrambled to comfort her. No one rushed to contradict his words or soften the blow. Guests remained seated, whispering to each other, but leaving her standing alone at the front of the room. The irony was unmistakable. She had seized the microphone to humiliate me, to control the narrative, and in the very same space, he had turned it against her. In one quiet declaration, the script was taken from her hands. Beside me, Mark remained motionless. But I could feel the shift in him, the way his posture eased, the long breath leaving his chest. This was the moment he had never thought he would see. His father, quiet for so long, finally speaking without fear. For Mark, it was a sign that the balance of his family had changed forever. His mother's voice no longer filled every corner. Meanwhile, she stayed fixed in place. Her lips trembled, her eyes shimmered, but no fresh performance came. She couldn't faint, she couldn't conjure weakness. This was not a scene she could flip into control. Her husband had chosen the final move, and for once she had nothing to follow it with. What remained in the hall was a silence that seemed to hold everyone still. It didn't last long. Eventually people rose or whispered, trying to process what had unfolded, but it left its mark. The image she had so carefully constructed for decades faltered in real time before her entire circle of friends and family. All the gleaming decorations, the perfect table, settings, and the elegant speeches she had rehearsed did nothing to shield her from what had landed. Guests eventually began murmuring again, eyes shifting between her rigid stance and him, who calmly stepped down from the front and returned to his seat. The anniversary party hadn't ended in applause, but in shock, and in a way that made clear to every single person present who truly carried the last word in that marriage. And while I sat absorbing what had just unfolded, I noticed something else begin to take shape. People around the room started to lean toward me, offering quiet words, a squeeze of the hand, or even just a glance that carried sympathy. The pull of attention was changing again, but this time not toward her. What followed in those moments revealed just how different the room became once her grip slipped away. Aftermath and community reaction. The air in the hall stayed heavy after my father-in-law's calm announcement. While he settled into his seat beside Mark and me, the ripple across the room was clear. Guests who had been frozen a moment before began moving quietly in my direction. Some approached with cautious words, others just offered a hand on my shoulder or a glass of water. They weren't grand gestures, but they mattered. They chipped away at the feeling of being alone under the spotlight. An aunt who hadn't spoken much all night leaned down to quickly hug me and whispered, "Don't let her wear you down." Then she slipped back into the crowd without making a scene. That became the rhythm of those moments right after. Steady, quiet reassurances directed at me. Old family friends asked if I wanted fresh food or a break outside. A cousin cracked a gentle joke about us all feeling like part of a live reality show finale, which almost made me manage a laugh. People seemed eager to let me know I wasn't the one they blamed, even guests who had never given me much attention before. Their small remarks gave me something solid to hold on to, while my hands still trembled in my lap. On the other side of the room, the contrast was stark. My mother-in-law stood by herself, shifting her weight, tugging at her necklace, searching for a familiar anchor that wasn't there. For years, she had filled gatherings with her voice, kept relatives in her orbit through force of personality, but now silence surrounded her. No one approached with comfort. Even the friends who usually echoed her opinions kept their distance, staring down at their plates or whispering quietly to each other. If she expected rescue, it never came. It was an almost surreal reversal. She had built her reputation around commanding conversation and playing hostess with superiority. And yet, that night, nobody rallied to defend her. People weren't admiring her polished image anymore. They were whispering about her cruelty and the calm decisiveness of her husband walking away. The control she clung to for so long had folded beneath its own weight, leaving her in the same crowded hall but strangely alone. Mark stayed close beside me, his hand steady on mine. He spoke very little, but every glance he gave me said what words didn't need to. Then came the moment when his father, after leaving the microphone behind, walked across the floor and pulled up a chair next to us. It was simple, just a man choosing different company, but the ripple it set through the room was sharp. Everyone saw it. Everyone understood it. He had not only announced he wanted a divorce, he had chosen, physically and openly, to place himself with us. That choice didn't lose its meaning in the days after. When the formalities settled and guests filtered home, he kept his distance from her, but not from us. In the weeks that followed, he moved into our home. At first, it felt unusual, having him at the breakfast table, carrying in his things one box at a time, but soon it folded into an easy rhythm. He didn't make it dramatic. He simply explained he had no desire to live in her house any longer. The legal separation unfolded more quietly than the spectacle of the party, but it still sealed what we had witnessed that night. Divorce papers were served shortly after, a fact impossible for her to hide, since every extended family member already knew it was coming. The prenup they had signed years earlier limited what she could claim. She kept a car and a joint account, but the house passed to him. It was neither cruel nor generous. It was simple division after years of imbalance. For once, pieces couldn't be spun into trophies, only into facts. For me, the emotional aftermath wasn't something I could sweep away quickly. Months of conflict and years of subtle cuts don't vanish in a single night. The public humiliation at the anniversary and the twisted accusations burned longer than I wanted. It took therapy to really unpack the weight of it, to separate her voice in my head from my own. Talking to a professional gave me tools I didn't know I needed, ways to rebuild confidence after so many undermining comments, and permission to grieve what should have been celebratory milestones she had stolen. Through it all, Mark stood firm. Having his father living with us shifted our home in unexpected ways, but it also brought comfort. We shared meals, conversations, moments of quiet. What had been fractured for decades was beginning, in a different form, to heal. And in that house, without her shadow looming, life grew lighter. We weren't perfect, but we were steady. For the first time, it felt like the family balance was reset in a healthier way. Community perception outside the house reflected the same shift. Word of what happened spread quickly, as things in families always do. But the tone wasn't against me the way she had tried to frame it. If anything, people moved closer in sympathy. Conversations at later events carried quieter respect, nods, or quick assurance that they were glad to see us standing strong. Meanwhile, she remained conspicuously absent, choosing distance after the humiliation that left her without defenders. There were no more stages for her to claim, no more dinners where she could casually slip in those well-aimed barbs without consequence. The moment she chose the microphone to attack me, she lost the control she had guarded for so long. The community reaction sealed that reality. She was no longer the figure people admired or followed. They had seen behind the polished image, and once revealed, it couldn't be unlearned. For me, the meaning in all of it wasn't about her downfall. It was in realizing what endurance and boundaries can actually build. Every small choice to hold my ground, every time Mark spoke up, every quiet support his father showed in the days after, it all added up to something bigger than the chaos she created. It became proof that cruelty bends under its own weight, and that respect survives when you choose not to let someone else define your worth. In the end, she was left with the trappings she always valued: clothes, appearances, and empty judgment, but stripped of the power they once carried. And I was left with something stronger: a calm marriage, a home that welcomed healing, and the knowledge that even in the loudest storms, dignity can stay intact if you choose it to. And that's exactly what her story revealed most clearly. What I learned through all of this is simple. Setting boundaries and standing firm with your partner can break even the deepest patterns of control. I won't pretend it was easy, but therapy gave me tools to process the damage and rebuild confidence, and today Mark and I are steady and happy together. If you've ever dealt with an overbearing in-law, drop your story in one line in the comments. I'd love to hear how you drew your own boundaries. And if you enjoy these real-life drama stories, hit like and subscribe. Until next time, take care of yourselves and your peace.